Welcome to JLive. I'm Laura Mandel, JArts Executive Director, and it's great to be with you for JLive, our JArts virtual series of bite-sized conversations about Jewish life and art with some of the best Jewish artists. Today, I'm with fashion designer Samuel Mendoza Fraiman. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so specifically we're together today because you have a piece in our show that just opened, Be the Change, the public art movement that is launching here in Boston. So let's start there. We invited you to be one of 6 artists in this project because we just loved what we thought your vision would be to help make change in our world through art. And you have created this larger than life fantastic piece that's speaking to transgender equity. And I think it's something that I've learned a lot about from you already. So can you tell us about this piece and where the concept comes from?
Yeah, I love that you said larger than life. In making this piece, I was thinking a lot about scale. They're like these 8 feet tall female forms. And I'm a fashion designer. I've never sculpted per se. I'm a draper, so a lot of my work is sculpting on the body out of textile, but this was a different material. It was a different approach. And it was interesting to me how sort of these shapes organically came out as like larger. Like it wasn't like me trying to make like really big scale. I was just like, they were just sort of inspired by like very close folks to me, and sort of as I was making, they were just getting bigger. And I kind of appreciate that sort of from a creative perspective that these shapes became larger than life. Trans equity, particularly for trans people of color and for youth, is an incredibly important issue for me for many reasons, right? Not only because of some of my closest family and friends are trans people, and not only because I'm an educator in a space with lots of young trans individuals becoming amazing artists, and but because just generally as a gay cis man, this is an issue that I feel like we are never paying enough attention to and never giving enough to, and I feel like very important. I feel very privileged that I have the rights I do in this country, and I have access that I have in this country to get married, to have children, to have healthcare through my husband. That's not those rights are not all extended to our trans siblings, and I feel strongly that we can't just count our wins and forget our losses. We have to fight for all of us to have not only liberation, but also prosperity and joy in life. So for me, for this project, that's what this is about. It's small and it is not my story to tell, but it can be a story that I want to amplify. And it's a small step using art to bring people's attention to the pieces I'm making, and hopefully through the piece, which is constructed of a textile with QR codes printed. It's right behind me. Each QR code leads to an organization here in Boston that's doing important work in the trans community, for trans people of color, for trans youth, for trans young Jewish individuals. And each one kind of takes you to a donation page, and the idea, it's a tzedakah box. Donate, take a picture, donate, go to the website, and also learn a little bit more. Part of this is also the fact that like we as a society aren't super informed about things we don't we don't daily inform ourselves on, and so I think the more we can be informed, the better. And so hopefully this is a little step forward.
I know I was excited when we invited you to be a part of this project to see what you would do, because I was thinking about, as a fashion designer, where does that take you sculpturally? And I just am so blown away by these. I mean, we just said, like, you're so glad we said larger than life, because this piece is about scale, but there's just something so moving when I look at those 3 bodies, those 3 dresses together, and it tells such a story beyond just the QR codes. And then when you scan them and you can learn a lot more. I mean, I know for me, it was even enlightening, to be honest, when you told me that one of the biggest problems that trans kids often have is like if they're looking to rent an apartment or move out and find a safe space, that they either don't have the funds, the ability to get an apartment. I mean, those very basic things that I think most of us don't really think about. And I just so appreciate that you're able to illuminate that through the grandness of these pieces that draws people in, and through the QR codes to actually direct us. So I just think like the level of education you're giving us there is really tremendous.
One of the sites that the QR codes lead you to is an organization raising money for trans folks to change their names on their IDs, right? That's a cost that they incur, and that's a cost that not everyone can pay. It can be prohibitive, and it's a privilege that our names are there as we desire them, and not our, and for these kids to get the right name on there and to not have their dead name on their ID is important. And again, they feel small to some folks, they're major in many ways. So yeah, I think as a sculptor, I mean, it's very interesting. As a designer, my first thought in this project was like, okay, the textile. And that's why like the first idea was like, how am I going to print these QR codes? And like I had the idea, like I worked with a friend to design like the print itself with the different sizes and colors and how it was going to work out, which was really exciting because as a designer, that's kind of like more my jam. But I think what ended up happening is I like morphed into the sculptor and became much more fascinated by creating the forms themselves, which was not an initial sort of going into the idea, not really what I was thinking about at the beginning. When we first had conversations about this, and becoming sort of the person who was creating the forms was very different for me, and really beautiful. It was a really sort of, I did it in the summer. I'm an educator, so summer is kind of like quiet time for me. I get to like read and kind of just hang out with family, and getting to take some time to do that and to be outdoors and to create these forms, it brought something out. I think as I reflect a lot on my career as a designer, I've been making one-of-a-kind handmade dresses, gowns for women for over 15 years. And clients used to laugh at me because I would like ask them to come in and I would have a piece of fabric and they'd be like, where's my dress? And I'm like, I'm about to make it on you. And so for me, I've just been like moving fabric around people's bodies, which is a really delicate, beautiful privilege, to have people's like, trust, right? To be vulnerable in that kind of space. That relationship has been a part of my work for a very long time.
Well, and I just have to say, you brought that in so beautifully to this work thing. And I was so privileged to stand there and watch you do this. But I was even thinking about how, like, conceptually, thematically, there was something so amazing about having these large scale bodies that you were draping this fabric on, thinking about transgender and this like transition. I mean, literally, of you draping the fabric, it was just really cool to experience.
Yeah, it's kind of like what I love to do, right? And it was, I realized that like, oh, organically these shapes come together because I've been smoothing fabric over bodies for years. And so like smoothing the wire over to create these forms was really beautiful. Yeah. And it was like, I try to be really mindful as well. There's something of there's obviously as an artist, as a sculptor, you're creating, right? But the creative energy that it takes to make a piece, the creative energy it takes. I channeled a lot of like friends and family who have in many ways created their bodies, right? Created themselves into the image they wish to be and they see themselves as. And that's really beautiful. And I see that with the young people as well, right? It's sort of human development, high school, you're just creating the image of who you are. Think about like, in those moments, I was thinking about like my rabbi, right? Rav Claudia, talking about being created in the image of God. And
that's what I was just thinking. I was thinking of Rav Claudia saying
and
that.
So as I'm forming, I'm like, okay, what am I doing? Like, I'm making these human images. What am I doing? And it was really, I tried to really put a lot of intention in that process, right? I'm not just creating a form to drape a dress on. I'm creating these images, right, of people who are meaningful to me. And so I also took different approaches, right? Different ways of adding or subtracting density to the body. I tried very mindfully to create like a basic form, and then like to add to the form in like to sort of like lift and add and create more volume and more like shape as like a process, right? And thinking a lot about like, this is the process that some, not all, but many trans folks have to engage in. And like, again, this is not my story, this is not my experience, but to think about the people I care and love doing this, and what a beautiful thing to do.
Well, and I just think it's kind of amazing that you've been able to translate that whole feeling and issue into this art, both physically through the creation and in what we see as the end result. I mean, I think it's just really special. And I hope everybody who sees the piece will hear you talk about this, because I think that's really what brings it together so magnificently. Okay, so I want to shift for a second, because you talked about Rav Claudia and how important she is to you. And I also know that you were not born Jewish. And so I want to know, tell us, how did you come to Judaism? What was this? Was there a moment when you were like, I want to be Jewish, and why?
Yeah. I grew up in Texas. I'm Latino, from a Mexican American family that's like deeply rooted in who I am. And but religion always played a really big part of my family's life and in my life growing up. And so religion was always a very comfortable space for me, right? And I think that was also like uncommon. It's uncommon for especially folks in my generation to be like, I like religion. not the most popular take. But for me, it was always something I was drawn to. Even when I was pushing away from it, somehow I would find more of it in different spaces. But I, my best friends in the world are Jewish. And I think that was kind of a turning point, is just sort of being like, this is my family, right? When your friends become your family, and then your family is who you want to be with all the time. My family grew, right? It didn't change, it just grew. And that family was Jewish. And I was like, there was more of me who was like called in that direction. And it was, I talk a lot about sort of my parents' sort of experience with Judaism as like sort of from a religious study perspective, and how that kind of influenced early on really my like take on Judaism. And so it felt very natural, right? When I, chose to become Jewish. It wasn't necessarily surprising to anybody, and was also really natural because it just felt like confirmation in some ways. And Rav Claudia was a big part of that journey for me at TBZ, because that was just sort of like the shul I found. I sort of, it's funny, when in converting to Judaism, you also learn a lot of vocabulary. Like my husband was like, we're going to start shul shopping. I'm like, what's shul shopping? Like, this is confusing us from a fashion perspective. So shul shopping took, as usual shopping, I went just bought the first thing I saw. So went to TVZ, fell in love, and was like, oh, this is it. Here's Rav Claudia at the Bima, mixing English and Spanish and Hebrew. And I'm just sort of like comfortable. And my husband is, speaks all three languages as well. So I was like, oh, this is like our little home now. Like, this feels right. And so my journey to Judaism was a series of sort of feeling more and more at home, more and more with family. And I think that's kind of what it feels really special to me, and why I'm so connected to Judaism, because of that feeling. It wasn't necessarily intellectual. It wasn't necessarily all about the davening. It was just family. It was home. And that's important. The other parts become important to me, and are still important to me. But yeah. And so now I'm heavily involved. I'm sort of the typical convert, where I'm like, now I'm on the board of my shul. I do everything at shul. I'm on several committees, and I'm very committed.
You got roped onto the J Arts board.
Got roped onto the J Arts board. I'm like,
and I was going to say, Sam, for somebody who did not come up, in this tradition, I find it amazing how many leadership roles you have taken on and how expansive your leadership and reach has been in the Jewish community. And I also just have to say, it's no wonder that you bring, your teaching, your love for teaching and leadership and teaching clearly into this very much. And I just have to say that we wanted you to be a part of Be the Change because we also see so clearly in all of your work that social justice and making change in the world, especially in a Jewish context, is so important to you. So I'm curious, with that in mind, like outside of Be the Change, are there other either dresses you've made or projects you've worked on or things you've dreamt of doing that would really combine that intersection of like your love for Jewish community and life, possibly social justice, and your work? Like, what could that look like, or what has it looked like for you?
Right. I feel like it's all of my work. And I think that it's, thinking about like pinpointing specific things, it's kind of hard. It's kind of a combination, it's at all moments. And I think like, we talk a lot about that in like different spaces of privilege where people say like, oh, I get to pick and choose when I have these conversations. And for me, it's like, they're always happening at all times. We're having Jewish conversations when I'm at school. We're having conversations about equity and education for students of color when I'm at shul. We're having conversations when I'm in a board meeting about like where there are gaps in equity and more, there could be more of a liberatory lens on whatever discussion we're having, whether it's finance or policy. Those conversations are always happening, and I think that's important for me, that I'm able in all of these spaces to bring my whole self forward. And I think that's what I appreciate about my shul, TBC. That's what I appreciate about being part of J Arts. That's what I appreciate about the school I work in, right? I'm given this opportunity, but more than opportunity, I don't love the word opportunity always. I'm given space to be my full self in all of the different forms that takes at different times. I think my parents and my grandparents were huge leaders in their religious communities. And I always knew that was something that you're supposed to do. And so coming into this religious community, and just being in any community, right? It was always I always knew and I felt you have a responsibility to give and to do what you can to help folks who can't. And so for me, it was very like duh and very natural, and it's sort of a privilege, I think, that I get to do that, and that I get to take some leadership or to lend a voice when needed, and to really represent all the parts of me that are important in these spaces.
Well, and I was just going to say, Sam, I feel like everything you just described to me in a nutshell is like the epitome of what it means to be an American Jew today.
Absolutely.
That it is not one homogenous thing. And I feel like so much of what we're thinking about through Be the Change, through J Arts programming, through, work with the arts generally in our community is like, how do we explore the diversity of the Jewish experience? Because everything you're saying is the American Jewish experience. And it's
right.
not necessarily what people would have expected 20, 30 years ago.
Right.
And I think it's something that's so powerful about what you bring to this work. I mean, even you're just talking about how all of your work is part of the Jewish experience. I mean, I think that is a really important way of thinking. It's like you're bringing your whole self to this.
Absolutely. I mean, I didn't convert to Judaism to just like hide that part of me, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm very privileged also, and very lucky that my partner, my husband, is also so, he is someone who lives his full life and full self in all of his spaces, right? And so to me, I get sort of that confidence to do it with him as a partner, and so many other folks who live in that way. It's really important. It's really important to not deny any part of ourselves, especially in the current moment when so many different parts of ourselves are sort of, you can say at risk, but also, trying to be quieted. And I think it's the moment to be louder.
Amen. Totally. And I know I promised us 20 minutes and our time is about to close, but I just have to say that one thing that struck me that we were actually talking about yesterday is how you have a tattoo of a cactus. And I looked at it and I said, what are you, Israeli? That's a sabra. And then you proceeded to explain to me that it's a symbol of your grandmother's. I just want to talk about that for a second. Like, tell us about this tattoo and how you feel like that actually does everything you just talked about, representing like many sides of you.
Yeah. That tattoo's funny. So I wanted a tattoo. We were in Tel Aviv, my husband and I, and my grandmother lived in West Laco, Texas. It's in the valley, Rio Grande Valley, El Valle. Shout out 956. And it was sort of my dreamscape. I always tell people this is also like the one place I always dream back to. Like, I have recurring sort of this is my like home base kind of feeling. And so to me, like, that garden is really meaningful. And it was like, cactuses in the back. It was paint buckets and tire vases full of different geraniums and asparagus ferns. There's papayas everywhere because it's the valley, so there's always papayas. And sour oranges. And this is the space where like I feel like most connected to a lot of things, and it's why I go back to it. So it was really meaningful. And I had this idea. I was like, nopal, it's cactus. It's not only one of my favorite fruits, it's also one of my favorite foods, nopalitos. Like it's just like, this is the right thing. And it was growing in my grandmother's backyard, and you just go cut off a leaf, you cook it, you're done. So that was my first one. And then I was like, okay, in Tel Aviv, like, they're everywhere. I'm like, Yarden, like this beautiful giant nopals. I was like, Yarden, this is what I want. He was like, that's really funny. Like, Israelis, blah, blah, blah. Like, I was like, oh, because prickly. And I was like, I'm experiencing that for the first time, like very prickly. Also my husband, it's sort of like, whose family is Israeli, sort of like Israeli and Uruguayan, Uruguayos. And so I was like, yes, this feels right. So I went and got a cactus, and it was sort of the funniest little like thing, because it turned into now like developing all of the garden and getting more and more additions to it. And again, it's sort of a reminder of like space and how space and the meaning behind those spaces can change over time. And you could create meaning over time. And it's not that it changes or the history of it disappears, is that you add and that you extend and you grow. And I think that's been a big part of my journey through identity, through creative work, through into education. And as a Jew, you're just adding and extending your journey further and your story further. So that's my little cactus tattoo.
I think that was the perfect summation, Sam. Thank you. Like I said, I promised us 20 minutes and we're at time, but this has been so nice to understand how your Jewish identity informs your work, to hear more about this Be the Change piece. I hope everyone out there will have a chance to go out and see the pieces that are in Fenway through the end of October. Whether or not you do, there's lots of information online. You can get an audio tour with Sam when you go to see the piece. So I hope everybody will check out Be the Change and Sam's beautiful work. And thank you so much. More to come, but thank you for being a part of this with us. It's really special. And I'm glad you brought your whole self to this party. So thanks, Sam. We'll see y'all soon.